Alright, so following up on the last trip report, given the intensity of that last experience, I wouldn't be going back to psychedelics for quite a while. That took place in the winter of like 2018, early 2019, and I wouldn't be retouching psychedelics again until the autumn of 2019, which again would be LSD. This time, the batch I got a hold of was not as potent. I think these were party tabs that people like use at raves and things of that nature because they were very weak compared to the batch I used in the previous trip report. Now, having sampled one of them, I had estimated its potency to be around maybe 50 UG compared to the previous one, which were 150 UG per tab. So I just figured in my mind that, all right, well, if I triple up on these tabs, that ought to equal the potency of the previous batch. So I took 6 tabs of this particular batch. And so it's my guesstimation that it's still around 300 UG. And the potency was very comparable, so I would say that was around the same range. What I did find interesting, though, is that you think in your mind as a layperson that as long as the math is the same, the effect should be the same. Like, well, both are around 300 UG total, so the effect ought to be the same. But there's definitely a difference in experience when the tabs are concentrated, when it's like just a few heavy dosage tabs compared to several low dosage tabs. And I don't know if it's just a matter of like how quickly it is released into your bloodstream or whatnot that affects the experience, but I definitely found there to be some very noticeable differences in the come on, how long it took, and the intensity, where it happened, and also this experience was a lot more body centric. I got a lot more very intense vibrations within my body and less so in my head. And it was, I'm not going to say less visual, but compared to the types of visuals I got in the previous trip report, these were visuals of a different nature, and we'll get into that. So with no further delay, now this took place at a friend's house, and just for a little bit of background, because it's I guess it's sort of relevant to how the trip unfolded. This was with some friends at a friend's house, and they have some property like kind of out there in the wilderness, away from the city, and they have a courtyard where you enter the house, and upstairs they've got a balcony that overlooks the courtyard and gives you a very beautiful view of the wilderness and the mountains on the horizon out there where this person lives. So we all went upstairs and partook of the sheet, and I guess I was the only one that took as much as I did because I wanted to match the dosage of the previous trip report. I wanted that same kind of effect. I found it to be very profound. It made a very significant impression on me, and I just kind of wanted to attempt to repeat that type of experience, whereas everyone else who partook just kind of took 1 or 2 tabs and just wanted to have a good time. So I guess me being the only one who had as much in me as I did, I don't know if I just started acting very giddy, very goofy and silly, because I did get some bubbliness as the come on started to happen. And I don't know if this annoyed my friends or amused my friends, perhaps some combination of both. But when I started to kind of, loosen up and act a little giddy, they all just kind of got these cheesy grins on their faces and kind of shoved me out the door, out onto the balcony I just described, overlooking the courtyard. And this was in the middle of the afternoon. It was a beautiful sunny day, clear blue sky mostly. There were a few like Unicus clouds kind of floating around in the sky. And they just shoved me out there onto the balcony with a bag of Habaro gummy bears, and we're like, here, go sit out there and just kind of enjoy nature. And I guess they mostly found it amusing rather than annoying, because I could still hear them through the door kind of laughing and making comments. I could hear them muffled comments through the door sometimes. So yeah, so I sit out there and I kind of take in nature, and at this point I'm getting tracers and fractals and all the other signs that would come on, and I'm approaching my peak here, eating these gummy bears. And this friend, their courtyard previously had like a travertine tile covering up the courtyard, but for whatever reason they decided to replace the tile, and they were in the middle of that project when we came over for this hangout session. So the tiles were all removed and stacked up by the walls of the courtyard, and the sand that was underneath was exposed. So I'm standing up over the fence of this balcony looking down at the sand in their courtyard, and the sand was starting to take on the appearance of what I can only describe as like ancient Mesoamerican art. You know, the stereotypical artwork that we might think of, like, you know, from like Mayans and Toltecs and Aztecs and whatnot. I'm sure for those of you viewing, if you've made it to this very niche corner of YouTube and the internet, then I would venture to guess that most likely most of you have seen the Aztec sundial, this like round sunstone that has like the face of the Aztec sun god in the center with the 8 cardinal points coming off of it. It was very, very similar to that. It was, I mean, it wasn't that exact same piece of artwork, but that same style of artwork was happening in the sand as I'm looking down to it. These figures, these humanoid looking figures that the shape of which looked like the way humans and humanoids are portrayed in Mesoamerican artwork is what they looked like. And that was very fascinating. And I think that was in part influenced by, one, the fact that the friend who owned this house, who was hosting us at this little hangout, they themselves are of Hispanic descent. And so there's a lot of Hispanic and Western style decoration throughout the house. Even the house itself is very like Western style. So that probably influenced me when I start looking at the sand, and I'm kind of being reminded of like desert culture and Western, you know, Western themed stuff. And then no doubt that's what I end up seeing is, you know, like Mesoamerican style art happening in the sand. And what's interesting about this particular part of it is that while these figures were stationary, they weren't animated or moving or interacting with each other, they didn't hold the same form. It was very similar to, like, as I've explained in other videos, when you try to read in a dream, you think you're reading, but you're not actually reading. Your mind's just filling in the blanks. Like, for instance, in a dream, if you see a billboard with a golden arch on it, your mind may fill in the symbols as saying McDonald's. So when you wake up and tell someone about the dream, you're like, yeah, and then I saw McDonald's. And so you may contest what I'm saying here and think like, no, I can read in dreams. I've read in dreams before. No, you haven't actually read. You think you've read, and your mind fills in the blanks. But if you ever have a point in a dream where you see quote unquote letters and you remember what I'm saying right now and you try to linger and study the symbols and try to read, make out what the individual letters are, you can't, because they aren't stationary. Like, you try to read the word, sometimes the symbols aren't even actual letters of whatever language you know or are reading in. Like, I guess in my case, English. Sometimes they do. You know, you might find an A and a B and a C, but it's all incoherent. It doesn't make actual words that make sense. Other times they look similar to English letters, but they're not actually letters. They're just, again, incoherent symbols. And the thing about them is they're never the same twice. When you read over a line and then you try to go back to the beginning to really make it out, like, okay, well, how is this spelled again? Like, it was a B and an M and an A, and then you go back to the beginning where you thought there was a B. It's no longer a B. It's like a D now, or a Q. And then you go down the sequence and every letter or symbol has changed. And that's why you can't actually literally read in a dream. It was that same kind of phenomenon with these figures in the sand. They all were consistent, that they all always looked like this Toltec, like Mesoamerican style of art, these humanoid figures, and they were stationary, not really moving around or interacting with each other. But when I would, and there were dozens of them because they covered up the entire sand of the courtyard. But when I would look at one and then look at the others and see what they looked like and what position they were in, and some might have been, you know, throwing a spear, and others might have been holding up a shield or whatever, or others just interacting and doing these weird, like, Egyptian style poses and dances, I would look at one, then I would go to look at the other, and then go to look at the one next to it, and then my eyes would kind of linger back to the previous one, and it had changed slightly. Still very similar, but it wasn't exactly the way it was when I looked at it previously. And then I would go and look at the others, and it was the same phenomenon. They were very ever so slightly shifting each time my gaze would divert from one to the other. And what came to mind in this moment was like, oh, I bet this is what Terence McKenna was talking about when he has described on several psychedelics, but initially his DMT experience when he encountered his infamous self-transforming machine elves. I think that was a term that he even coined that has taken on a life of its own in psychedelic culture. But I've never encountered those machine elves myself on any psychedelics. I've always wanted to, but I have not yet had that experience. But when he described them as self-transforming, I think this is maybe what he was experiencing or referring to. Maybe he wasn't. I haven't come across any of his literature or any audio of him really describing in detail what he meant by self-transforming machine elves, but I think this is the phenomenon that was going on because you're in an altered state of consciousness, similar to a dream. Maybe it's like when you read in a dream, or when I saw these, Mesoamerican figures in the sand. You can't. They never hold the exact same form at any given gaze at them. They never hold the same form twice. Like you look at it, your eyes divert away, you come back to it, and it's altered ever so slightly. Still very similar so that you can recognize it, but it's not exactly the same as it was the previous time you looked at it just a few seconds ago. And I'm thinking that may have been what was going on with these self-transforming machine elves. So I was like, oh shit, okay, this pretty cool. I kind of like this effect. It was very entertaining, even if it didn't bear much, spiritual or psychological significance to me. So that was cool. I sit back down in the rocking chair on this balcony and I start gazing up at the beautiful sky and the nature, and the mountains on the horizon started to have like, rainbow colored vibrational waves coming off of them. And I start eating some of these gummy worms. And like I said, the sky was mostly clear, very bright blue, very bright sunny day. Luckily the sun wasn't in my field of vision at this point. It was already behind me. But some of these Unicus clouds that I mentioned, very thin, long Unicus clouds, were starting to float more and more into my field of vision. And when I stared at them, and this was probably the most fun and entertaining part of this particular trip, even if it wasn't the most, significant part of the trip, these Unicus clouds, these white Unicus clouds, took on the form of Asian dragons. Which I'm sure you're all familiar with. You know what I mean when I say that, like how their style of dragons in the East is very long, worm-like bodies that kind of, slither like a snake, and they have faces that are very mammalian instead of reptilian. They're very like feline, like cats and lions, or sometimes they're very canine and they look like dogs or wolves. You might think of Falkor in the Neverending Story, which is pretty much exactly what these things looked like. There were only about 3 or 4 of them in the sky, but as I'm sitting there like actually staring at them while I'm peeking, they took on the form of like and these were animated, they weren't stationary, of animated Asian dragons, like flying and interacting with each other and starting to swirl and intermingle. And then they noticed that I was looking at them, and all their heads turned and looked at me. And they didn't seem too amused that I was staring at them. Like they weren't malicious, but it was almost like offended, like when you're out in public with strangers and you just stare at a stranger. That's considered offensive and rude behavior. And it's almost like they kind of took on that demeanor, like they looked at me and like, what the fuck are you looking at? And so they started to fly down at me, and it was very 3D. They were somewhat realistic, but at the same time, the substance of their body still looked like clouds. Even if the details of their face clearly looked like Asian dragons, you could tell these were Asian dragons made of cloud vapor. And they started to fly down at me, and like open up their mouths and come in like they're gonna bite me. But some part of my mind, and I don't know if this is because I was still in the giddy stage of my come up, of my ascension to my peak, but I didn't take it seriously. Like, I knew that these things shouldn't exist. Like, dragons don't actually exist. This can't be real. So as they're flying towards me, and when I say they had 3D depth, it pretty much is exactly like what you might think. Like when you go to a 3D movie and you put on the 3D goggles, the way it just looks like some of the characters in the screen just kind of come off the screen. It's not so realistic that you could ever confuse it with real life, but it's realistic enough that it makes you want to stick out your hand and go, wow, this is pretty cool technology. Like, how are they doing this? And then, you reach out your hand and you can't ever actually touch the 3D projection, but it looks like it's coming off the screen. These dragons kind of had this effect. Like, they were coming towards me, and they didn't quite look 100% real. And like I said, my mind kind of knew, like, this isn't real. These dragons don't actually exist. So I actually, instead of being like fearful of them, because I know a lot of people freak out when they start to see such imagery on psychedelics, I was actually very, very entertained. I thought this was amusing as hell, and I started laughing hysterically. And as they're flying down at me, trying to like kind of, I guess, like scare me or intimidate me into not staring at them, they're coming down and opening up their mouth like they're gonna bite me, but they never quite come all the way to me. But they get at least to me, in my trip, in my delusion here, they look like they're getting close enough where I could reach them. So I look around and I had the bag of gummy bears in my hand, so I just grab gummy bears and start chucking them at these, you know, Chinese dragons made of clouds that are flying towards me. And my gummy bears, of course, are going right through them because they don't actually exist. And I just found that to be the most amusing thing. Like, look at this. Another one comes at me and I throw a gummy and the gummy would pass right through it. And then the thing would come like close to me but never actually touch me. And then it would fly back up into the sky. And yeah, like that was wild. That was one of the more fun, vivid trips that I've had while on a psychedelic. Because I've had several vivid trips, and they aren't always, you know, like carefree kind of fun. A lot of them are fun, and a lot of them are enjoyable, even if they're intense, but for different reasons, for, you know, psychologically stimulating reasons. But this was just like carefree fun. Like, look at this. Like again, like watching a 3D movie with 3D goggles on. Like, are these things real? They can't be real, right? Now look at this. My gummies are going right through them. And it was at this point that I could hear my friends still inside the room on the other side of the door, still inside the house while I'm out on the balcony, laughing. They're all just like laughing hysterically. I could hear their feet stomping, and I could hear some of them kind of murmuring, like, what the hell is he doing? Because naturally they can't see the dragons that I'm seeing. So I'm sure that looked very comical. But it was worth it. I really enjoyed that part of it. And that was another thing that kind of helped me, as I mentioned in previous videos, helped me bond with, like, for lack of a better word, the spirit of this chemical, the spirit of LSD, of LSD, like, just kind of making these anchors in my mind of like, I really, really enjoy this substance. This is my favorite substance. This always gels with me. You know, this knows what I want to see and what I want to feel in any given moment. So yeah, that was super wild. Sorry, I tried to make some notes here to remember which points to talk on here. But yeah. All right. So yeah, so that was the last part of the trip that I had on the balcony. I think at that point my friends probably started to get a little concerned that I was getting too delusional, as I was just randomly wasting food and throwing gummies out into their yard. They're probably like, all right, time for him to come back in. He's a little too far gone. So they bring me back inside, and we're like, let's just go downstairs and hang out with the goats and chickens, because this friend, you know, they had lots of acreage on their property, and as a hobby, they raise goats and chickens and other livestock out there. Sometimes, you know, goats and peacocks and things of that nature. So we go out there and we let the goats out of the pen, and these goats are more like pets. They're not really raised for livestock. We definitely don't eat them or milk them or anything. They're very tame and docile goats, so we just let them out and we walk around with them on this friend's property and let them graze on the bushes and grasses and things of that nature. And as I'm petting the one that is our favorite goat, because it's a pure white goat, and I think they're pygmy. I don't know all the different breeds of all these different goats, but it's a, you know, miniature goat, probably only about 2 feet tall and maybe about 60 pounds. And beautiful, beautiful goat. And I start petting on her, and this is where I'm definitely peaking at this point, like full on peak. And this is where I mentioned, like, taking a lot of low dosage tabs doesn't quite have the exact same effect as taking just a few high dosage tabs. It's very more body centric, and that must have something to do with like how the rate at which the substance enters your bloodstream, because it's on more paper or something like that. I'm not a chemist or biologist, so I wouldn't really know, but that would be my guess. Very much more body centric. Like, I'm just getting these very, very intense vibrations just all throughout my body, and that's starting to affect my vision, as far as like making my vision very vibratory, and things are kind of cloudy and they're not very clear. But I could recognize this goat, and I just remember getting this very primal connection or recognition of this goat. And I'll explain what I mean here in a moment, because all right, I'm petting the goat for a little while and I start to wander off. And like I said, because the vibrations going throughout my body, including my eyes, were getting so intense, my field of vision was starting to kind of tunnel. Like, within a few feet at the very center of my vision, there was a pretty clear circle where I could recognize everything that was in front of me, but everything else in my vision out that was vibrating, oscillating at such a high and intense vibration that it was not clear. Like, it was very fuzzy and I couldn't quite make out what was in the rest of my field of vision. Also, the peak was getting so high and intense that this was the very first time I started to experience the very first symptoms of what I would later understand to be ego death. I didn't undergo ego death in this trip, and wouldn't for the next several trips, But I could find that, but I started to find that as I was increasing in dosages with my trips, that I was getting more and more into the threshold of ego death. And this is where I started to experience some of the first symptoms of crossing that threshold, and this in particular being amnesia. And I think that distinction needs to be made because I think a lot of people out there who are not very well versed in psychedelics, they like to think they've had an ego death, and they'll come back to you bragging, and which that in of itself kind of says something about their ego. But they'll come up to you like bragging, like, "Oh my God, I've had an ego death. I know totally what you're talking about, man. I've been to the other side and all this shit." And they haven't really experienced ego death. They've experienced amnesia. Ego death is a lot more than that, though it does certainly include parts of that. But I think you start to lose a sense of identity, but you haven't lost any humanness. You haven't lost any functionality of your brain and your rational mind. You just kind of start to forget who you are, where you are. You know full well you're human, and you know you're an adult, and you know you're on Earth. But even like language starts to like, you just start to recognize things. You don't really think in terms of language. You don't think like, oh, I'm in the middle of the wilderness and I'm walking on a path and these sorts of things. You just kind of recognize stuff as concepts and not with words. And perhaps it's because the chemical is shutting that part of your brain down. You don't have access to a lot of your memory. And so, yeah, I'm starting to wander away from my friends, and because of the effect that was happening to my vision that I just described a moment ago, I only had to get like a few meters away from my group and from the goats and everything to where I couldn't even see them anymore. And I was literally like lost. Now they could still see me, and then, they were still kind of trip sitting me. So I don't think either of us, not myself or them, had any fear of me getting genuinely lost. But when I wandered away from them, I didn't recognize where I was. I didn't remember where I was. I didn't remember who I was. I just knew that I was a human trying to survive. And since I couldn't see my friends anymore, I just knew that, like, in other words, and this is what I described to my friends when I started to come down, I was describing this portion of the trip to them, I felt like a lone caveman in the wilderness. Even my sense of time and how much time had passed and how long I had been alive started to slip away from me, and I couldn't really remember like what my agenda was, why I was there. I just knew I had to survive. It was very, very primal, as I've mentioned before about LSD. Like, as as it starts to peak in intensity, it strips away layers of you from like your human level down to your mammalian brain and down to your primate brain, or I guess vice versa actually, down to your primate brain and then your mammalian brain and then your reptilian brain and so forth and so on. And I think this had kind of peeled back layers of me to where I was just pure like primate, like Homo sapien, like caveman out there. Like, I walked around in this friend's yard looking at bushes and looking at rocks and sticks, and I'm kind of recognizing what these things are, and I knew that they were necessary to my survival, but I couldn't quite make out like why these things were important. I just remember seeing a stick as I was walking by next to a bush and picking up the stick and being like, having not in words, not in language, but just having the concepts in my head of like, this is useful somehow. This is useful for something. I should hang on to this. And I just remember kind of walking around and like finding a rock and like part of me knowing what the rock was, but not quite being able to remember or articulate what the rock was. So I'm like taking the stick and like tapping on the rock and being like, this is something familiar, but I can't quite recall what it is, and it's something useful. So like, I forget what I'm supposed to do here. And I set the rock back down and just kind of crouched down by it and like having this feeling of like, I feel like I should do something, but I'm not quite sure what it is. And in hindsight, it was like this feeling of like, I need to start a fire because nighttime is gonna come soon and there's no one else around, I'm all alone. Again, like these very like stereotypical like caveman behaviors. But here's, getting back to the goats. Like, I stand back up and I start to head back in the direction that I came. That was the only instinct that came back to me. Like, all right, if you don't want to get lost out here in the wilderness, just head back the way you came. And as I start to head back, I could kind of make out in the distance like silhouettes of my friends as my vision was starting to clear up. But I could immediately, in full detail, recognize the goat that I had just mentioned. And she like looked at me and she kind of tilted her head. And again, I can't recall, given the state that I was in, I don't know if this actually happened or if I was just hallucinating this part of it. But she looked directly at me and she kind of tilted her head like she could tell that something was a bit off about me. And she started to approach me and like give out a little bow. And that when she, there's a word for sheeps. the sound that sheep's making. It totally escapes me right now. But we'll just go with ba. So when she started to ba, that like triggered some kind of very primal, tribal kind of instinct. Like, in other words, the best way I can articulate this is that like it awakened this sense of like archetype, like tribal archetype, like recognizing the goat as like the totem animal of my tribe. Like, because I was stripped down to this like pure caveman tribalistic type of thinking, like my brain had totally reverted back to like hunter-gatherer mode. And like I reckon like this goat was like a beacon. Like, follow the goat and you'll make it back to your tribe. You'll make it back to the other humans. You're not the lone caveman here in the wilderness. You will find other humans if you follow the goat, because where there are domesticated goats, there will be other humans. And again, I wasn't thinking this out in logical sequence or in human language. It was just totally like instinctual, intuitive ideas and concepts. But like, I don't know, just some portion of my brain kind of opened up when she bawed like that. It was like a light bulb went off and it was like, yes, this thing, follow this thing and it will get me to the other humans. And it was like, I don't know, like maybe genetic memory or something, purely speculative on my part right now, but maybe it kind of triggered some kind of genetic memory of like how our species evolved alongside of the livestock that we domesticated for millennia, for thousands of years. And so somewhere in our human psyche is this archetype of like treating these livestock as like totem animals, that like they served a multifunctional purpose. Food was not the most, while it was a crucial role that they, or a crucial benefit that they provided to us, was their food for their milk and their skins and their meat. The most important benefit that these animals provided to us is this kind of anchor that I'm talking about, this kind of psychological anchor, this totem. When you're at that very primitive stage of your species development, you're just now starting to come together and formulate the very earliest stages of what we now know to be society, community. When our species was still at that very primitive level of developing these things, we hadn't quite fully developed them yet, but we were starting to understand. We survive better when we're together. We survive better when we bring in other species to help us in our survival as well. It was like this memory, this like genetic ancestral memory of like, this was the real function that these livestock had, was as like the tribal totem, as like this beacon, this guide, like follow the goats and eventually you will find other people, because other humans also use the goats and need the goats. So yeah, you might be in an inebriated state where you don't recognize where you are, but the goat is not. And like I said, for some reason it seemed like the goat kind of recognized that I was a little out of sorts and not my normal self. Because it was almost like it was calling to me. Like it kind of tilted its head and recognized something was off, and then it sort of called to me to come to it. And then it would lead me to the rest of my tribe, my other friends. And sure enough, that's what happened. And that was kind of the sense that I got. Like I just walked up to the goat and petted it, and then as it walked back the few feet, the few meters back to my friends, I walked back, and then like my friends were back into the clear space in my vision again, and I could recognize them. And it was like, oh yeah, right, that's what's happening. I'm Donnie Jep, and I'm at my friend's house. I'm in the 21st century, and I'm high on drugs right now. That's what's going on. Oh, okay, gotcha. But this same phenomenon happened a few times. Like again, like eventually I would kind of get bored or just get like mesmerized by what I was seeing on the trip. So I would again wander away enough to where I couldn't see my friends anymore, and I'd be right back in that same scenario. Not really afraid, not panicked or anything like that, but just kind of understanding like, oh wow, if I keep wandering off, you know, I might get lost and I might need to survive on my own. And these like caveman instincts start boiling up and taking over, and like, I need to find sticks to make wood, and I need to find stones as flint stones to make a fire or something like that. Anyway, so that was interesting. I'm not sure if what I said really made a lot of sense to you. It makes sense when I rehearse it in my head, of course. But that was a very interesting like probe into like the deeper layers of our psyche. Like I said, maybe a tapping into some genetic memory of things that we don't have experience with ourselves in this individual human life, but in our genetic code as a species. Like these things are kind of embedded, like imprinted on us and carry with us from generation to generation. So anyway, eventually my other friends, since they didn't get anywhere near as high as I did, they weren't enjoying themselves quite as much. So we put the animals away and they're like, hey, let's go out to eat. Okay, cool. I wasn't too thrilled with that idea because I felt like I was too high, that I wasn't going to be able to function in public. By the time we ended up making it to the restaurant that we were going to eat at, I had come down enough to be functional and whatnot. But, so everybody's, you know, we put the animals away, everybody's going back into the house to kind of get ready to leave, and I'm just standing outside, looking up at the sky, and by the time they all come back down and we're ready to get into the car and we start driving, this portion of the trip takes on full effect. And what I see as I'm looking up to the sky, the entire sky, like just the entire blue sky all the way down to the horizon where it meets the earth, basically took on the exact form of what is known as the Flammarion engraving, which again, I'm sure a lot of you, if you've found your way to this very niche corner of the internet, then you probably have an interest in these things that you're hearing me talk about. And so you've probably seen some version of it, which is this. But yeah, that is pretty much exactly what I saw in the sky. I just remember getting this, like, wow, like this, very much overtaken with a sense of awe and wonder, and like something that I'm viewing something majestic, maybe even divine, cosmic, and definitely got the sense of like, I'm seeing the mechanics of the cosmos here. Now, let me also state, one little difference is that I know the original engraving, I don't think it was in color, but some people have taken that engraving and colored it and pasted it on the internet. What I saw wasn't colored. It was still the color of the blue sky, but with different shades on it, because I've explained this before, the way a lot of these visuals look on psychedelics, especially LSD, is it's like glass. It's like someone has put a lens or a sheet of glass over your vision, so you can still see the real world behind this glass, but on the glass is where the fractals and waveforms and all these other visuals are happening. And so, yeah, it was translucent. All the forms that I was seeing were translucent, so they still had the color blue, but in different shades so that I could make out the shapes that I was seeing, but I could very clearly see them, and they were moving and animated. But yeah, a lot of concentric circles forming this dome that was the sky over all of us down to the horizon. And they were spinning, like, they were spinning contrary to one. Like one layer would spin clockwise, and then the layer right above it would spin counterclockwise, and then the layer right above it would spin clockwise again, and so forth and so on, up until you reach the peak of this dome. And within each one of these circles, I saw those shapes, like in the Flammarion engraving, where it was gears and cogs spinning and turning and cranking, and other different parts of machinery that I didn't really recognize. It was actually a lot more detailed than the Flammarion engraving, but that painting was immediately what came to mind. And I'm like, holy shit, I'm seeing the mechanics of the cosmos. I'm seeing the Flammarion engraving. And I just remember feeling this like sense of like affirmation, like, oh, I wonder if this is why, because the artwork, the Flammarion engraving, is anonymous. We don't know who actually made it. But in this moment, it was like there was this epiphany of like, oh, I bet the artist who made that saw it because of this. They were partaking of some kind of psychedelic substance, kind of being consistent with Brian Murarescu's thesis of the book that I've been reading also on this channel. That a lot of the significant developments in our culture throughout human history have been heavily inspired and influenced by psychedelics, by what people see and experience on psychedelics. And it was like, as I'm seeing this, I'm like, oh, holy shit. The guy that made the Flammarion engraving was totally dripping his balls off. That's why he saw it. He saw this. He saw what I'm seeing right now. And this sense of like kindred spirits who are, even though we're removed in time and space, it was just kind of this sense of like a connection. Like, oh yeah, like I have brethren out there who have also seen the very same thing I'm seeing. And that was cool, and it lasted the entire, it lasted the entire drive to the restaurant that we were going to eat at. As I'm looking out the window, looking up at the sky, I'm like, wow, holy shit. And sticking my head out the window to make sure it's not just, not that these weren't just visuals being triggered by the window itself. Roll the window down, I'm like looking out the window of the car, and I'm seeing it, and it's staying consistent and moving, and it's just like, wow, wow. But then as I follow it down to the horizon, And I'm looking and seeing this illusion of how it's surrounding us like a dome. Naturally, my mind went into a different space. And I got this very distinct impression of like, holy shit, the Truman Show. Once again, we're back to that same thesis that LSD keeps trying to show me and drive home, which is some version of a simulation theory. Like, holy shit, so the sky is not what I thought it was. The earth is not what I thought it was. We're in, allegorically speaking, the freaking Truman Show. We're being watched by something, and all of this is being deliberately designed and generated and simulated by something. I don't know what it is, but I'm seeing the mechanics of how it's generated right now. And I remember being swamped with all these thoughts and suddenly all these memories of, like, you might say synchronicities, little clues that have been dispersed through culture and experiences throughout my life. I remember one thought in particular that came to me was, aside from the Truman Show, was there was an episode of Rick and Morty where they also had to deal with simulation theory. They had been trapped in a simulation by an alien, and as Rick started to see the clues that they were in a simulation, he's like, "Run, Morty, we gotta get to the edge." And he was like, if you run fast enough, the simulation can't keep up with you, because in order to save data processing power, it only ever simulates your immediate surroundings. Like, it doesn't simulate the entire world. It only simulates the part of you that your five senses can take in at any one given moment, which I guess for us humans here in the real world is as far as your eyes can see out to the horizon. And I remember getting that very distinct impression of like, oh yeah, that's what's going on. This is also articulated in the movie The Mandela Effect, which touches on this as well, which is saying that, like, yeah, if it's true that we are in a simulation, then it's most likely the case that not all of us, not everyone who we think exists actually exists, that the actual portion of humans that are experiencing the simulation are just a fraction of the global population, and that the portion that's being simulated is only ever what we're experiencing at any one given time, in order for the simulate whatever force or machine or whatever that is generating the simulation can save data processing power. In other words, it's more akin to like when you're playing a video game. And I know I'm dating myself with this reference, but I haven't played video games in decades, so I'm going to go back to the best example I can think of, which is The Legend of Zelda, the original one. And you know how when you're playing that game and there's a select screen that you have where you can see the map of the entire world of Hyrule that Link, the character you're playing, is in as he's trying to find Princess Zelda. Because I know that a lot of people get that confused too. The character with the sword, that's not Zelda, that's Link. He's supposed to find Princess Zelda. Anyway, and he's doing this in the land of Hyrule, where all these monsters and creatures and magic creatures live. And there's a select screen you can have that takes you out of the screen that you're playing, where you're wielding the sword and whatnot, and it shows you a map with a little dot showing where you are. So at any given point in this game, while you're playing it, the entire world of Hyrule always exists. But the portion that you can only experience in any one given moment is what's on your screen, which is not the entire world of Hyrule. In other words, that video game only simulates the part of Hyrule that can fit on your screen at any one time. And then when you walk to the next screen length, the screen scrolls up, and then there's the next portion of Hyrule. So that way, the game saves computer processing power. It doesn't have to always simulate the entire world of Hyrule the entire time that you're playing the game. It only simulates the portion that you are in, that your TV screen can show to you at any one given time. And it's that similar concept at play here with this Flammarion shit that I was seeing, this mechanics of the cosmos, and the sense of like, we're in the fucking Truman Show, we're in some kind of simulation. It's like, it's a dome. And yes, the entire Earth exists, but it only exists as information, as data. Most of it, rather. Most of it only ever exists at any given time as data, as information, as code. And what's actually being converted into a five-sense experience is what's happening here in the dome, whatever is happening within the space that our five senses can perceive. And then it's only like, if you were to drive or fly or wherever past that area, that then the simulation would follow you. Again, like in Rick and Morty, where it turns out they were running on a treadmill. They thought they were running on a road, but it was actually a treadmill. and the simulation was like moving with them on the treadmill. And Rick was telling Morty, like, if we run fast enough, the data processing power of the simulation can't keep up, and so it'll kind of glitch out. And you can run past, for a few seconds, you can run past the simulation and see the real world until the simulation catches up with you. And so that was what I was starting to get the impression of while I'm seeing this, like, holy shit, we're in the Truman Show. We're being watched, and this whole thing's a simulation. And the world as we know it doesn't actually exist that way, but it exists like this. And the simulation changes as we move. We don't actually change our geographic location. Instead, the simulation changes around us and makes us think we've changed our geographic location. So that was some wild shit right there. I feel like I had something else to say relevant to this trip. But no, I think that touched all the main points that were worth discussing. But yeah, we eventually made it to the restaurant, and we ate. That was my first time eating while peaking on acid, and that was it makes, and again, because this is also a lot more pronounced body high, it did make the physical sensations a lot more vibrant. So food tasted a lot more delicious, but it did also kind of get me into this like existential, like, overthinking mode of like, what is this? Why am I eating this? Why do we need to eat? Why do we need to fuel? If all of this is a simulation, then isn't my hunger also just a simulation? Am I really hungry, or do I just think I'm hungry? And all this kind of weird, like, these thought loops, these rabbit hole thought loops that we go down sometimes when we're on these substances. But yeah, I do also remember, and I don't want to get too much into this part, because I want to save these thoughts for future videos because they'll be more relevant, and I don't want to risk being more redundant than I already am when I'm going into these monologues. But on the drive back, as the LSD was starting to wear off, and as I said before when I talked about the amnesia, this was the first trip where I started to experience, or I started to fluctuate within the threshold, not fully into ego death, of course not, but I'm starting to approach that threshold of where ego death happens. And so I'm starting to experience some of the very first come-on symptoms when you're starting to, what I would later recognize as ego death. One of these symptoms was, it starts to give you an insight. It starts to give your consciousness perspective on itself, insight into the very workings of your consciousness itself. Like, it didn't just show me the mechanics of the cosmos. Later, on the ride back home, it was starting to give me glimpses into the mechanics of myself, or at least what I think is myself. And it started to get very existential. And luckily at the time, because I had a full belly and I was still feeling, like I said, LSD, it cradles you, and at least in my experience. And it gives you tough and intense concepts while holding your hand and kind of petting your head and making you feel good about it. But I just remember on the ride home, lots of dialogue from the show True Detective, featuring Matthew McConaughey, which there's a lot of clips of around on YouTube, where he also goes into his thoughts, his very pessimistic thoughts on the nature of consciousness and existence and time and so forth. And I remember a lot of his words playing in my head, and it's starting to give me a little bit of existential dread, but the acid kind of talking me back down and telling me, look, it's okay. You're not learning anything new here. It's just new to you. What these circumstances that you're thinking about right now have always been the case. Does that mean your life is meaningless? Does that make any experiences of your life that much less significant? These circumstances were always the case your entire life. You just didn't know it. That doesn't mean that you have to start viewing your life with doom and gloom or existential dread, or like, consciousness is like an illusion. It's not what I thought it was. And like, I don't know what's gonna happen after I die. Will we cease to exist? Is there some form of an afterlife? These kind of thoughts are spinning around in my head. And like the nature of time, time is a flat circle, as Matthew McConaughey goes on about in that show. I just remember a lot of his monologues from that show playing in my head as I'm staring at the sky, and still not seeing the mechanics anymore, but still seeing fractals kind of bounce around in the blue sky. And the sun was starting to set at this point, so it was also starting to turn a little bit magenta. And maybe that also is what kind of triggered these thoughts in me, because of the whole archetype of like how the rising and setting of the sun is often used in a lot of mythology and religion as a metaphor for, you know, birth and death, and even maybe even the cycle of reincarnation, as well as it rises again and then dies again. And thus the setting of the sun is, you know, that's archetypal language for, you know, what we use to describe poetically the end of things and transitions, often death, sometimes physical death, but also just transitions of significant phases in our life. And so maybe that was what was starting to trigger this thoughts loop in my head of like, well, what's going to happen when the sun sets on my life and my consciousness? But like I said, even the very way that I was experiencing my own consciousness in this moment was something I had never felt before, and I didn't really know how to articulate it. I certainly would a few trips later, because I would experience it more fully and would finally undergo full-on ego death. But here's where I was starting to get to that threshold. I was starting to see on the horizon the mirage that I thought was myself, my consciousness and my ego, start to break apart into its constituent elements and be exposed for the illusion that it is. And it's weird. I'll elaborate on it more in future videos, because those trips actually gave me the language to better articulate the phenomenon. But all I know to say it is, it's just the way your mind is even thinking and feeling things is different. And it's like it's being given this meta perspective on its own self. And it's a real mind fuck. But yeah, as I said, we'll elaborate on that more in future videos. But that's it for today. Thanks for watching.